Edward, your windows overlook the lake.
No, an oversight, Fanny, had led me to one of the family rooms, but I've rectified the situation and am very happily installed in the guest quarters.
Hi, welcome to another video. I'm taking a deep dive look into the character of Edward Ferrars, the man who can barely finish a sentence and yet somehow manages to fracture hearts, offend a wealthy mother, and captivate Eleanor Dashwood, all while giving the impression that he might actually lose a duel with a doorknob. Yes, he's a conundrum in a cardigan, and I've said it before, and I stand by that wholeheartedly, but he's also quietly radical if you read him through the lens of Jane Austen's values. So let's see what we can do with this cardigan-wrapped enigma, because honestly, the fact that he's so understated makes him an excellent candidate for a deep dive content, especially when you might think we already know him as the nice one, the safe option. First off, let's admit it, Edward Ferrars barely leaves a footprint when he arrives. He enters the narrative slowly, quietly, and almost unnoticed. And that's no accident. Jane Austen doesn't want you to look at Edward. Not yet. She wants you to listen, to observe. And if you do, you'll find he's not just a shy man, but one who's already entangled in moral dilemma long before we even realise he's part of the story. And he carries that dilemma almost to the end of the narrative. A man of hesitation or something else? At first glance, he seems hesitant, awkward, almost underwhelming. Austen herself teases this in chapter 3, where we're told, Edward Ferrars was not recommended to their good opinion by any peculiar graces of person or address. He was not handsome, and his manners required intimacy to make them pleasing. It's certainly not the most glowing endorsement, is it? But that's the skill of Austen. She's signalling to us that Edward isn't for show. He isn't performing romance. He's just trying to exist without falling apart, which, when you know his backstory, becomes a lot more interesting. And his manners required intimacy to make them pleasing. That tells me that we need to really get to know him, to get to know his intimate circle before we start truly seeing who he is. He doesn't dazzle and he doesn't charm the room into silence. What he does is notice Eleanor. He spends time with her. He talks, not flirtatiously, but sincerely. He builds a relationship based on companionship, not conquest. And that might be the most radical thing in the whole novel. Austen gives us a man who isn't trying to be desirable. He's trying to be decent. Because we know his story and his engagement with Lucy, we can understand why he moves slowly in developing his affections for Eleanor. At the end, he informs her that he loved her from the moment he saw her at Norland.
Every day since I first saw you, my love for you has grown.
And this forms our understanding of him, even if Eleanor can't see it. His moral stance must be causing some major conflicts internally for him. In comparison with Darcy, who can afford pride, and Willoughby, who can afford to be flash, Edward is a man already boxed in by his mother's ambitions, his youthful mistake with Lucy Steele, and his total lack of appetite for social ladder climbing.
I'm a grave disappointment to my family, Miss Dashwood. Fanny would like me to be a great man of some sort.
He isn't tortured in a grand tragic hero sense, I don't think. He's more likely tortured in the way many good people are, quietly, inwardly, and without much hope of applause. He's in emotional lockdown, and Austen gives him no way out until he meets Eleanor.
Good morning.
Oh, I was just...
Beating carpets.
Yes.
Edward Ferrars, how do you do?
One of my favourite moments at Norland is the map scene with Margaret Dashwood. And for a moment, we see him without any reserve. Now, we know it's not in the novel, it's a creation of the 95 film, but it rings true because here, he isn't awkward or conflicted. He's kind, present. And you get the sense that Eleanor saw that version of him long before anyone else did.
Do you, by any chance, have such a thing as a reliable atlas?
I believe so.
Excellent. I wish to check the position of the Nile.
And that brief softness is exactly what draws Eleanor to him. no fireworks, no potential, a man who's still kind, even when under pressure, and even Mrs. Dashwood spots it. No sooner did she perceive any symptom of love in his behaviour to Eleanor than she considered their serious attachment as certain and looked forward to their marriage as rapidly approaching.
I don't think we should leave Norland until we see how things stand between Eleanor and Edward. Can you see? They've formed an attachment.
And yet she and we misread just how complicated that attachment already is. Edward isn't free. He isn't even emotionally available. He's bound by an old promise, and it will define every one of his actions from this point on. What are we meant to do with Edward Ferrars? He's not thrilling or witty, and he barely says what he means, and yet Jane Austen gives him to us as one of her most morally consistent characters. He's not exciting, but he is honourable. In Austen's world, which is obsessed with wealth, sparkle, and social advantage, that's no small thing. And that's the thing Austen leaves us with here. What if the best men aren't the most visible? What if the real heroes of Austen's world are the ones quietly refusing to betray the people they once made promises to, even when it costs them everything? Lucy Steele may smile sweetly, but make no mistake, she's playing the long game. And Edward, ever honourable, became a pawn in that game before he even realised the rules. The thing that with Edward Ferrars is that his great moral dilemma is one of his own making. Back when he was younger and quite possibly desperate for approval from anyone, we know that Edward entered into a secret engagement with Lucy Steele. Now, whether he was charmed, cornered, or simply trying to do what seemed kind at the time, Austen leaves that unsaid. But Lucy, she knew exactly what she was doing. A girl of no fortune, perhaps little intellect, but one of the sharpest social climbing instincts this side of Caroline Bingley. And to make matters worse, he doesn't even seem to like Lucy, not properly.
Miss Dashwood, how can I...
You know Miss Steele, of course.
Not the way Eleanor deserves to be liked. And yet he won't break it off. Why? Because Edward, for all his hesitancy and awkwardness, is loyal to a fault. And I do mean a fault. It's not romance, it's obligation. Edward made a promise, and it might have been a foolish one, but he treats it like a sacred vow. We might call it naive. Austen, I think, calls it honour. And it's this internal struggle between honour and happiness that defines him. And if we're being honest, it's painful to watch.
If you send Lucy away, Mother, I must go too.
Go then.
Edward mopes and flounders. He can't tell Eleanor what's going on. And she, ever the master of composure, doesn't push him. Their scenes are full of what's not said. Whole paragraphs of emotional tension packed into polite half conversations and sad glances over breakfast tea. And then Lucy drops the bomb. The reveal, the heartbreak, the quiet devastation. When Eleanor discovers Edward's secret engagement, through Lucy, no less, it's not just a betrayal, it's a collapse of trust, hope, and for her, emotional progress. Austen doesn't give us a dramatic confrontation, she gives us Eleanor quietly absorbing the blow, offering only the barest outward response, while the reader sees the storm behind her eyes.
Edward and I have been secretly engaged these 5 years.
And that's where Austen's treatment of Edward becomes so quietly effective. He doesn't fight for clarity and he doesn't offer explanations. He just endures, perhaps out of guilt or honour. It's maddening, real, and somehow deeply moving. He becomes the man who would rather lose love than break his word, not because it's noble in a shiny epic way, but because he doesn't know how to do the right thing, even if it means being deeply unhappy. And Eleanor? She doesn't rage. She doesn't fall apart. She listens. She sympathizes. She even speaks kindly of him long after she has every right not to, because she understands more than anyone else that Edward is not cruel. He's just stuck. And that's not weakness, that's principle, painfully applied. So here he is, Edward Ferrars, a man engaged to someone he doesn't love, honour-bound to a promise he regrets, and silently in love with a woman who can't help but wait for the version of him who might be free. How do you dramatise that? Well, you don't, you narrate it with restraint and nuance, of course, with Jane Austen's unerring sense of real goodness, often moving beneath the surface until it's nearly too late. Adaptation aside, playing the pause. In both the 95 and 2008 adaptations, Edward's emotional paralysis is played with a fair bit of distinction, though in different ways. In the 95 version, Hugh Grant gives us an Edward who carries his convictions quietly.
Eleanor as well, you see. That must be enough for both of us.
And indeed, and how do you enjoy London, Miss Marianne?
But make no mistake, they are there. When he speaks, he does, clearly, firmly, and without apology. Just watch how he corrects Fanny. No raised voice, no dramatic monologues, just calm, deliberate truth.
My dear Fanny, they've just lost their father. Their lives will never be the same again.
He tells her what she doesn't want to hear, and crucially, he doesn't wait for her approval. Now, that's not weakness, that's resolve. And in his scenes with Eleanor, we see the same careful restraint, not because he lacks feeling, but because he has too much of it and no acceptable outlet.
Miss Dashwood. Eleanor. I must speak to you.
He's not twitchy so much as contained. He's guarding something precious, his promise, his dignity, and yes, his affection. When the truth comes out, he doesn't duck or dramatise it. He just lets it land. It's not a performance of shame, it's a performance of strength under pressure. And it absolutely works.
Eleanor, I met Lucy when I was very young. Had I had an active profession, I should never have felt such an idle, foolish inclination.
Then there's the 2008 version with Dan Stevens playing Edward, with an almost alarming degree of internalization. He doesn't do much, but that's the point. His silence becomes his own kind of protest. You can see him folding inwards during every scene with Eleanor. There's a weight on his back that no one else seems to see.
I saw the logs. I enjoyed this work. A man can relieve his feelings.
And he wears it with a kind of weary self-control that makes you want to reach through the screen and say, you can just say something, you know, just say it. But both performances capture Austen's original intent. What he is careful and principled. What he is not is timid and passive. And his resistance to social pressure, that's not avoidance, that's quiet rebellion. He knows what's expected of him, wealth, status, but he doesn't want it. Not because he can't handle it, but because he doesn't believe in it.
Money can solve some problems, certainly. For others, it's completely useless.
It's not shame that makes him seem hesitant, it's integrity. So he's stuck in a promise he regrets, and instead of wriggling out like a cad, he endures it. He doesn't lash out, he doesn't seek pity, he just kind of shoulders it. And Austen didn't give us a dashing hero here. She gave us a man who knows how to wait and how to hold the line even when it costs him. If we look closely, we see that Edward is a man of quiet moral strength, not emotional incompetence. And the way Hugh Grant and Dan Stevens play it, through measured speech, firm correction of Fanny, and the understated emotion in those final scenes, is absolutely deliberate. He's not a man without a backbone. He's a man who chooses not to shout. We know what we think of Edward Ferrars. Awkward, quiet, maybe a bit dithery. But what about everyone else? How do the other characters who actually live in Austen's world respond to him? Let's start with Marianne, because, she's not subtle. To her, Edward lacks poetry. He's not passionate enough. He's not romantic enough, and certainly not dramatic enough.
When snatched from all effectual aid, we perished each alone. Can you not feel his despair? Try again.
At one point, she wonders aloud how Eleanor could even entertain the idea of falling for someone so beige.
Can he love her? Can the soul really be satisfied with such polite affections?
And yet, honestly, you can see why. Marianne's been raised on sonnets and sensibility, so she wants fireworks, not flickers. But that's precisely what makes Eleanor's regard for Edward so powerful. She doesn't need him to sparkle. She just wants him to be steady. Where Marianne craves expression, Eleanor values integrity. She sees beyond the pauses, beyond the restraint. She sees a man who kneels to help Margaret with a map. The man who doesn't correct people to win favour, but to speak truth. And the man who, even when crushed by obligations, still chooses honesty. It's only when the truth finally breaks, when Edward comes to Barton and tells Eleanor that he's free, that the pieces all start falling into place. All the hesitations, the awkwardness, the distance, they weren't flaws, they were integrity bottled up. And now, finally, she sees him clearly. And that's the emotional payoff Austen was quietly building toward all along.
Will you marry me?
Eleanor, who prides herself on her restraint and logic, finally understands that Edward's silence wasn't disinterest, it was duty. And once that duty lifts, the clarity floods in. And then there's Colonel Brandon. Here's where it gets interesting. Brandon doesn't say much, but he respects Edward enough to offer him the living at Delaford. That's not just charity, it's a nod of approval from one reserved man to another. Brandon understands what it means to carry quiet burdens. He recognises the same moral backbone in Edward that drives his own sense of duty. So when Brandon offers Edward the living, he's not just offering employment, he's offering redemption, a way back to a life Edward can choose for himself.
Colonel Brandon, give me a parish. Can it be possible?
Mrs. Dashwood, for her part, is initially delighted by Edward's presence. She sees his kindness towards Eleanor and reads it, like many of us do, as evidence of affection. But once the truth of his engagement surfaces, she is understandably disappointed, and yet she doesn't condemn him. There's a sense that even she, in her romantic optimism, recognises that Edward isn't wicked, just trapped. And we can't forget Fanny Ferrers, his sister. She sees Edward's refusal to play the social climbing game as an embarrassment. She mocks his quiet ambitions, treats his humility as weakness. But really, her scorn reveals more about her than it does about him. Edward's unwillingness to play the game makes him inconvenient, and in Austen's world, inconvenience is often a sign of character. So it's through these other characters, through their expectations, judgments, and quiet affirmations, that we come to understand Edward more clearly. He doesn't dazzle on his own. He's illuminated in contrast, in what others say or fail to say, in what they expect of him and what he refuses to become. But here's the thing. No one in the story knows what Edward is carrying. They don't know about Lucy Steele. They don't know he's been engaged since his youth. They don't know that every pause, every awkward silence, every awkward dinner conversation is him trying not to betray that secret. And so what the other characters see is a man who's polite but stiff, kind but vague, kind of present but distant. And we, the reader, get the full picture. But the rest of Austen's cast, they're guessing. Marianne sees lack of poetry. Fanny sees lack of ambition. Even Eleanor, clever as she is, doesn't realise the full weight of the thing Edward's dragging behind him until much later. And that's the brilliance of Austen's construction. She doesn't show us Edward through a single lens. She builds him out of contrasts. He isn't fully known even by the people closest to him, not until it counts. Edward turns up at Barton Cottage a little poorer, but a lot freer. For the first time in years, he isn't carrying the weight of a promise he regrets. The engagement that shaped so many of his silences, it's over, and not by his doing. Lucy left him for his brother. Neatly done. But what now? He could have vanished or sat quietly somewhere with a book, but instead he chooses to come to Eleanor. And that says something. We're not told what he's planning. Austen doesn't give us his thoughts, but you can fill in the silence. Maybe he's walking up the path thinking, she probably hates me, but I have to try. Maybe he's rehearsing what he might say. Maybe he's got no plan at all and he's just hoping she'll listen. So whatever's going on inside, this is a risk. Because if she's moved on, if he's misread everything, then he's not just exposed, he's foolish. But he continues anyway. The misunderstanding that nearly breaks him. When he arrives, he assumes Eleanor already knows. In his mind, perhaps Lucy's written, or that gossip has reached the cottage. Of course, Eleanor does think that he's now a married man. She's trying to hold herself together, thinking he's just probably popped in to say an awkward hello while honeymooning nearby. And Austen wonderfully gives us just enough to see the panic across his face. He stammers, he flushes. He realizes in that awful moment that she doesn't know.
But then you've not heard. I think you mean my brother. You mean Mrs. Robert Ferrars.
And now it's on him to explain. But that reaction, that split-second collapse of Edward's usual restraint is revealing. He doesn't just fumble because the situation's awkward. He fumbles because Eleanor matters. If she didn't, he could have walked away, smiled, said something glib. But he stays and he clarifies. In chapter 48, we get Edward's confession and Eleanor's reaction, but it's all filtered through narration and summary, not direct dialogue. Eleanor, for a few moments, remained silent. Her astonishment at what she had heard was at first too great for words. But at length, forcing herself to speak, and to speak cautiously, she said with calmness of manner, which tolerably well concealed her surprise and solicitude. And later we get, Eleanor could sit it no longer. She almost ran out of the room, and as soon as the door was closed, burst into tears of joy, which at first she thought would never cease. That's it. In the novel, we get no dialogue like, I love you, no kneeling proposals, no declarations of long-held passion. Austen gives us emotion, yes, but internalized and managed, and only released in solitude. He tells her he's not married, that the engagement is over, that he's been disinherited but not broken. And while it's not a sweeping romantic speech, it's the most honest we've seen him. There's no more hiding. He lets her see him as he is, flawed, uncertain, but sincere. Why Eleanor, and why now? So what brings him here? Not just physically, but emotionally. He knows Eleanor won't flatter him. She won't pity him. She's the one person who never expected more than he could give. And Edward, I think he knows it. This isn't a last-ditch effort. It's not damage control. It's a return to the person who, maybe for the first time, made him want to be worthy of someone. Not just liked, not admired, but worthy. Now, if you're expecting Edward to sweep in, drop to one knee and declare everlasting love in poetry, this is Jane Austen, not Hallmark. The actual proposal, we don't see it in the novel. Austen keeps it modest. Eleanor cries, yes, but in private. The drama is in what's unspoken, which is exactly why the screenwriters gave us all the sobbing and stammering that the book held back. So here we are then, Edward and Eleanor finally together. No grand declarations, no fireworks, just resolution. After everything, Lucy, the silence, the misunderstandings, Edward ends up where I think he was always meant to be. But here's the one thing. The ending doesn't feel like a victory lap. It's not about romance in the way we expect. It's about steadiness. Austen gives us peace, but not passion. Edward, as we know, becomes the rector of Delaford, offered the position by Brandon himself. And that, in itself, is quite the full circle moment. Brandon, a man of action, Edward, a man of principle, both quiet, both constant, and now bound by trust. It's not just a job, it's a life and a future he can build on. Modest, perhaps, but free of the suffocating expectations that plagued him before. And with Eleanor by his side, he's not just surviving anymore, he's finally living on his own terms. Austen doesn't linger, but we can. Edward is now free, and he's exactly where he wanted to be, with Eleanor and with purpose. And he becomes a clergyman. He leads a modest life, and perhaps most importantly, he's no longer a man divided by promises. But if we're being honest, Edward does benefit from other people's pain. Lucy gets what she wants, Robert gets swept into a marriage he likely didn't expect, and Eleanor waits quietly and patiently. So yes, Edward is principled, but he's also fortunate. Other people bend so he doesn't have to break. And that said, he doesn't squander that good fortune. He takes the quiet path, the one he's long hinted at.
What do you wish for?
I've always preferred the church.
Back in my Margaret Dashwood video, I touched on how Edward's behaviour with her, his quiet guidance, his gentle intelligence, and his ability to join her world without instructing or posturing, felt like the early stirrings of the kind of man he would one day become, shepherding a parish. He doesn't lead by force, but by presence. And so a clergyman's life isn't just a suitable outcome. It feels like a kind of destiny fulfilled. Did he deserve her? I think it's a fair question. I know many of you in the comments will ask it. Eleanor is intelligent, emotionally generous, and quietly fierce. Edward is hesitant and at times downright evasive, and he never declares his love with conviction. He's not proactive, and yet she loves him. So we ask ourselves, is that enough? Maybe it is. Maybe Austen's saying that love doesn't have to be heroic to be true. Edward isn't dazzling, but he's decent, and maybe Austen's pointing to a deeper kind of worth. And that's why he matters. At first glance, we don't get Edward. We don't understand the man. He's awkward, mumbly, maybe even a bit limp-wristed. And when we first meet him at Norland, we don't see a man in emotional turmoil. We see a man who can barely hold a teacup without looking guilty. But that's the point. Because we only understand Edward in hindsight, it's only as the story unfolds, slowly, painfully, wonderfully, that we start to see the truth, that this quiet man was carrying a burden none of us knew about, that his reserve wasn't disinterest, it was restraint, that his silence wasn't coldness, it was conflict. And once that becomes clear, everything else starts to make sense, especially when we revisit the story. And by the end, we're no longer puzzled by Edward. We're cheering him on. Go, Edward, go. Go, Edward, go. We've gone from, is this man asleep, to give me an E, give me a D. Because he finally earns it, not by being dazzling, but by being decent, by doing the right thing, even if it takes him a whole while to get there. So no, Edward doesn't explode off the page. He unfolds, kind of like a letter you weren't sure was meant for you. But it turns out to say exactly what you needed to hear. And that's the beauty of Jane Austen. She makes even the quiet ones matter. Edward Ferrars isn't a character who grows by changing, he grows by revealing. By the end of Sense and Sensibility, he hasn't transformed into a bold romantic lead or discovered a secret ambition. What he's done is let us see who he really is: quiet, honourable, consistent, and even when it costs him everything. At first, we don't know what to make of him. He's withdrawn, hesitant. He says little and explains less, which is, of course, the way Austen planned it. She gives us a man shaped not by action, but by restraint, a man navigating a world that's already tried to write his future for him. His family expects him to climb. His mother expects him to marry well, and society expects him to be charming, successful, and decisive. But Edward doesn't want any of it. What he wants is something far simpler and far more difficult to hold on to: peace of mind, a life he can live with, and someone who sees him clearly. And that's where Austen places him, between two women: one who flatters him and wants to rise, and one who sees through him and wants nothing but truth. The brilliance of his arc is not in some explosive change, but in a quiet refusal to betray his better nature, even when it nearly ruins him. When the engagement to Lucy falls apart, Edward doesn't gloat. He doesn't rush to reclaim Eleanor. He walks into Barton Cottage unsure, vulnerable, stripped of fortune and certainty, but finally free to speak. And even then, he doesn't rehearse a speech. He just tells her what happened and hopes it's not too late. What do we learn from that? That for Austen, integrity isn't loud and love isn't grand. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it stumbles, sometimes it waits for longer than it should. But when it's real, it endures. Edward's not here to dazzle us. He's here to ground the novel, to show us that not all honour is glamorous and not all romantic stories need a hero on a horseback. Sometimes the most radical thing a man can do in Jane Austen's world is simply not pretend to be something he isn't. And I actually think Wentworth falls in that category too. So by the end, we finally see him as Eleanor does, not weak, not a fool, but a man who kept his word long past the point of comfort, and who, when he was free to choose, chose with honesty. Wasn't Jane Austen such a clever author? We might think we're being invited to read a love story or romance novel that would sit comfortably in the Hallmark section of a bookshelf. And while there's plenty of love kind of going around, Austen instead weaves intricate stories, kind of life stories, with moralistic issues, intertwining plot points and subtle, very subtle resolutions. And her mastery of leaving the reader with further questions just keeps us coming back for more. Such a skill. Can you imagine what we lost in a literary sense after her ultimate death? When you find something as good as this, you just keep wanting more. And more I sometimes do with my fan fiction. Right, my next installment. I had been juggling so hard with the whole, who is the story about? Is it about Eleanor? Is it about Marianne? Or is it about both of them? We know Sense and Sensibility, as the title hints, at each of the two women. So you've got Sense with Eleanor, you've got Sensibility with Marianne. So what I think I'm going to do to conclude the whole series, because we've only got the two of them left, is to do one more episode for Sense and Sensibility, but it's going to combine both Eleanor and Marianne, because they both have an arc. They're both Sense and Sensibility, because their roles kind of swap over. It's a clever juxtaposition. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that one. Anyway, that was Edward Ferrars, a man who holds back, for want of a better word, but there's a good reason for doing so. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.